With us now is Lydia Wileden. She is a U.M Ph.D. candidate and a DMACS Research Associate. Her research primarily focuses on measuring neighborhood perceptions and reputation and documenting processes of neighborhood change. Lydia, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. So you are a DMACS Research Associate. Tell us a little bit about that DMACS program and what that's all about.
Yeah, so DMACS stands for the Detroit Metro Area Communities Study, and it is a survey research project run out of the University of Michigan, primarily out of the Ford School of Public Policy and the Institute for Social Research, and led by Professor Jeffrey Morinoff and Professor Liz Gerber. And that survey project started in 2016 and collects data on a representative sample of Detroit residents to try to understand their opinions about different things that are happening in the city, to try to give Detroit residents a voice to help shape public policy, and also to, most recently, understand the effects of COVID on Detroit residents. So I mentioned that we started in 2016. That was when our first survey went into the field. In 2020, March of 2020, COVID emerged as a challenging dimension of our time, and Detroit emerged as a COVID hotspot, and we realized that we had the survey infrastructure in place to basically capture how the pandemic affected the health and well-being of Detroit residents. And so starting in March 2020, we pivoted a little bit to really focusing on the impacts of COVID and to a rapid response survey process. So instead of doing one survey every 6 months, we've now done 7 or 8 surveys just during this 18-month span of COVID. So we have a really nice repeated measure of how Detroiters are faring over the course of the pandemic.
And then in terms of the findings of these surveys, what have been some of the general results that you and others participating in the DMACS study have found? And maybe if there have been any surprises from your results so far?
Yeah, I think early on in the pandemic, one of the things that we found that really brought home some of the disparities that were being wrought by COVID was just the disparity in who knew someone who had died or gotten ill from COVID. And overall, we found that within Detroit, about a third of residents said that they had a friend or family member who had died from COVID. This is basically last summer. So that seems like a pretty high impact. I felt very fortunate that I didn't know anybody personally who had gotten ill. But when you look at the differences between Black Detroiters and white Detroiters and who knew someone who had died from COVID, the disparity was really shocking to me. 42% of Black residents said that they knew a friend or family member who had died from COVID as of last July, compared to just 11% of white residents. So Black residents were 4 times as likely. And this was around the same time also that we had a lot of demonstrations against police brutality and over-policing. And it really brought home this idea that there was a twin pandemic happening, especially in communities of color. So I think that, early on, certainly that was one of those findings that really surprised me. I think some other things, we see a lot of residents who have fallen behind on their bills, a lot of residents who have said that, if they were hit with an emergency $400 expense, they wouldn't be able to pay it. So I think some of these findings help show that COVID obviously has health impacts, but the impacts go so much further than that. And so those are some of our findings kind of early on in the pandemic, or maybe midway through. I don't know what the end point remains to be seen. But even more recently, we pride ourselves on having a representative sample. We recruit people based on their addresses. And so we have 2,000 residents spread across the city. And then we use survey weights to shift the population of our sample so that it matches the population of Detroit, because there's inevitably harder to reach respondents. And because of the size of our sample and the representative nature, we're able to make estimates of the rate of unemployment in Detroit and have a much larger sample than, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who also produces estimates for the city and the broader metro area. And our estimate in June was that 25% of residents who are in the labor force, so those who are either actively working or seeking work, were currently unemployed. And that was a much higher unemployment rate than certainly the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It was not too much higher than the current population survey, but I think that really brought home, especially this summer when we thought that the pandemic was maybe waning, that the level of need and also the level of people who were not able to return to normal remained really high. And I think in the months since, we all have seen the help wanted signs and probably experienced service disruptions just because there are so many people, so many businesses looking for employees. And I think our data sort of hinted that might be coming. So some of those are surprising.
We're joined by Lydia Wileden. She is a University of Michigan Ph.D. candidate and a DMACS Research Associate as well. And Lydia, there was recently a really interesting story, a concerning story from WXYZ TV. Nearly 38,000 Detroit residents lived, that said that nearly 38,000 Detroit households lived in quote-unquote inadequate housing in the past year, according to some studies, including yours. Your most recent report focused on home repair needs in the city of Detroit. What did you find were some of the most common needs in these home repairs, and just to what extent home repairs in the city of Detroit are necessary at this moment in time?
Yeah, so we included on our most recent survey, which was conducted in June of this year, June 2021, some questions about home conditions and residents' need for home repair. And that has been a story that some of my colleagues, especially at Poverty Solutions at the University of Michigan, have been following over time. And certainly a number of reporters and members of the press in Detroit have been focused on for a long time. And the basic idea is that while there's been a lot of conversation around concerns over evictions and concerns over foreclosures, and also concerns over property tax issues in Detroit, there's this other dimension of housing insecurity that maybe gets a little bit less coverage, and that is the condition that a lot of residents live in, and the need for home repair among especially low-income residents. And my colleagues at Poverty Solutions, I believe a year prior, had put forth a report that used a measure from the American Housing Study that assessed the number of the rate of inadequate homes in the metro area. So the Detroit, Warren, Dearborn metro area, and said, okay, if houses in Detroit are in inadequate condition at the same rate that they are in the metro area, they estimated that about 24,000 households probably lived in inadequate or poor quality housing. But we know that Detroit's very different in a lot of ways from the rest of the metro area. The housing often is older, the population is more heavily minority, and also there's a much higher poverty rate in the city. And so it was quite likely, and my colleagues at Poverty Solutions acknowledged this, that their estimate was probably an underestimate. And so we wanted to use our survey to say, can we refine that estimate at all? Can we give sort of an updated estimate of how many people are actually living in inadequate quality housing? And like you said, our estimate is closer to 38,000, which I think translates to around 91,000 residents. So in a city of around 650,000 residents, that's quite a sizable percent of the population. So you asked specifically, like, what types of housing conditions and housing needs are people living with? By far within the city, the most common issue that people are living with is just stopped up plumbing, or pests, rats, cockroaches, mice, that type of thing. But that's not what we were using to count how many people were living in inadequate housing. When we defined inadequate quality housing, we were focused on those who tell us that in the last year they experienced a major problem with lack of heat, exposed wires or lack of electricity, and either no running water or no hot water. So one or more of those 4 conditions. And that's where we get this estimate that around 13% of Detroiters experience that as a major problem in the last year.
We're joined by Lydia Wileden. She is a DMACS Research Associate and a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Michigan. And how has, over the course of the pandemic, the data from your studies changed or maybe been impacted by the continued impact of the housing crisis, particularly with people being able to pay their rent in a timely manner, and some of those landlord and tenant issues that have arisen because of that, especially after the federal eviction moratorium had been lifted earlier on, just a couple of months ago?
Yeah, we have tried to track how many people in our data are experiencing housing hardships, like being evicted or foreclosed upon. Unfortunately, because we have an address-based survey, sometimes those people, and because adverse life happenings make it less likely that you're going to find the time to respond to a survey, we haven't seen that much evidence of spikes in evictions and foreclosures, but I know that some administrative data from the state, I believe, suggests otherwise. But what we have seen is, like you said, people falling behind on their bills. And in terms of how thinking about home repair might reflect some of these tensions between tenants and landlords, one thing that we do find is that renters are nearly as likely as actually slightly more likely than homeowners to say that they live in inadequate quality housing. And that's important for 2 reasons. The first is that there are a number of programs that exist to help residents repair their homes that give grants or low interest loans to residents to engage in home repair. In fact, the city just launched in September a new program called Renew Detroit. But those programs are exclusively for homeowners. There you go. There's very little funding available specifically targeted to renters. And in some ways that makes sense, because renters shouldn't necessarily be responsible for the condition of their housing. You'd hope that their landlord is. But there are a lot of cases in Detroit where landlords are sort of intentionally neglecting properties, or feel that they have very little reason, and that tenants themselves have little recourse to push to have their properties maintained better. So we actually asked renters, have you made requests to your landlord to have your home repaired? And has your landlord been responsive? And among all renters, most say that their landlord, when they've made a request, has been at least somewhat responsive. More than 50% said they were either somewhat or very responsive. But when we look only at those renters who are living in inadequate quality housing, 38% said that their landlord was very unresponsive to their requests for repair. And again, thinking about the types of conditions that we're talking about, lack of heat, lack of hot water, possibly lack of electricity. These are basic living conditions that I think you or I can't really imagine living without. And that's a not uncommon occurrence for a lot of these renters, and they're not able to get their landlords to make the changes that they need.
In the case of homeowners, as you mentioned that these relief programs and funding programs through the city are mostly beneficial to homeowners instead of renters. For them, are those funds that are available to them or have been made available to them, have those been significant enough to mitigate some of these issues at a significant level for individual homeowner to individual homeowner? Or is there still, from what you and from what the DMACS research team has found, still a greater need for more of that relief so that these homeowners can afford to make those very necessary repairs to be living in safe conditions?
No, the available funds are certainly not sufficient. And I don't think that there's not one group to sort of point blame at for that.
Sure.
I mentioned the Renew Detroit program, which arose from, it's using ARPA funds, so the American Recovery Program Act funds, to help residents maintain and stay in their homes, which is, I think, a great use of these federal dollars that are going straight to cities. And it's an example of the city responding directly to a survey that they did that asked residents, what are your top priorities? How would you like us to spend this money? So that's part of what the Renew Detroit program came from, is the residents said, we need money for home repair, and the city made this funding available. But the Renew Detroit program is targeted to seniors, so those over the age of 62, and to residents living with a disability. So that means it's not available to all homeowners. It's really available to a select group. And it also only includes enough funding for around 750 residents annually. So, or 750, households annually. And, as I said, as we've discussed, if the scope of the problem is there are 38,000 households living in inadequate quality conditions, then addressing the needs of 750 of those is really, I think, a drop in the bucket. And some of your press colleagues have reported that already more than 5,000 applications for that program have been received. I believe that applications remain open until the 31st. So if you're a senior or someone living with a disability who is low income in Detroit, I encourage you to apply. But there's already a greater demand than there likely is ability to meet that demand. And that's only if you fall within these specific categories. So there definitely is greater demand than there is resources available.
We're joined by Lydia Wileden. She's a U.M Ph.D. candidate as well as a DMACS Research Associate. And on the vaccine front, the uptake in vaccination across the state of Michigan, across the U.S., has very much stagnated in the past several months. From what your studies have found on vaccination, what can you tell us about vaccine uptake in Detroit over the course of time, and especially more recently now, and especially also including the anticipation of children ages 5 to 11 being able to soon be vaccinated against COVID?
Sure. So I'll start just by caveating that our most recent data was collected in June and July. So in terms of being able to speak to what's happening right now, it's all going to be a little bit speculative. But what we saw when we did our survey in June was that by our estimates, roughly half of Detroit adults who were eligible had been vaccinated. That's a little bit higher than what the administrative data suggests. But that suggested there was decent uptake. Obviously, half is not enough to get us to herd immunity. And we also saw some really major disparities in terms of the age of people who were being vaccinated and the race of people who were being vaccinated. So we saw that white residents were a lot more likely to have been vaccinated than Black or Latino residents. But then, in fact, that is mostly driven by younger Black and Latino residents, those under the age of 40, who had yet to be vaccinated. So, a major push, I think, is ongoing in the city to try to get those younger adults to vaccinate. I know some great work by members of the steering committee that provides some oversight and some funding for the DMACS project, the My Seal program. Members of that steering committee have been very, very active in trying to get especially residents of communities of color to vaccinate. And what we've seen actually is that that persuasion campaign seems to be working. I had the pleasure of presenting some data on Tuesday at a national conference on public health that shows that among those who haven't been vaccinated, residents of color are much more likely to be changing their mind about the vaccine. And my colleague, Pastor Charles Williams, who's also a reverend at the historic King Solomon Baptist Church, there we go, in Detroit, as well as a student in the sociology department, he has said that part of the issue is that there's more of a wait and see mentality in some of these communities, that they weren't necessarily convinced from the get-go that they needed to get the vaccine or that the vaccine was necessarily safe. But we have seen over time a shift in vaccine intention in those communities towards getting the vaccine. And then once you are intent on getting the vaccine, we actually see that there's a pretty high conversion rate. So to throw some numbers at that, when we look at who has gotten vaccinated versus who told us they were very unlikely to get vaccinated, just 2% of white residents who said, I'm unlikely to get vaccinated in January of this year had been vaccinated by June, compared to 36% of Black residents and 70% of Latino residents. So that really suggests that in terms of persuasion, communities of color are, really much more dynamic, and they are, shifting towards vaccinating. And if that trend continues, which we hope to pick up in our next round of data, which we're starting to collect, I believe, in the next week or so, hopefully that will mean that there is a much lower disparity between white residents, Black and Latino residents in terms of uptake. And then you asked about children getting the vaccine, especially now that kids ages 5 to 11 have been cleared to get vaccinated. What we saw in June, when only those ages 12 and up were able to get vaccinated, was a relatively low vaccination rate. And maybe more concerningly, we saw that households with children, the adults in those households, were less likely to be vaccinated. So I know that the city and just the public health department of the state and locally has devoted a lot of resources and attention to trying to shift the minds of those parents, and also to affirm that the vaccines are safe, but that they're also important for kids. And that's something that we're hoping to pick up on in our next survey.